In the spring of 1913, a photograph was taken. On the porch of a rural Kentucky farmhouse, a family is gathered. 3 generations, 11 people, standing stiff and unsmiling in their Sunday best. But if you look closely at their faces, something isn't right. On some, the eyes are too close together. The skulls they're attached to don't match the jawlines. At an unnatural angle, one child's hands curl inward. With a gaze that suggests something vital was left out when she was assembled, another stares past the camera. This isn't a trick of old photography. For 10 generations, this is what happens when the same blood circles back on itself again and again. This is the Whitaker family, and their story is a biological horror show that modern science tried desperately to forget. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The way graves keep bodies is the way the mountains of Appalachia keep secrets. Into hollows, towns were built, where the nearest neighbor is 3 miles through woods that don't forgive mistakes. Where families arrived in the 1700s and never left. A gene pool became a gene puddle, then a gene drop. Then for something medicine didn't have a name. In Odd, West Virginia, the Whitaker family lived. The name itself feels like a warning. Population 471. No stoplights. No police station. Just families who'd been there so long they'd forgotten they were supposed to marry outside the bloodline. The Whitakers weren't ignorant. They weren't backwoods monsters. They were isolated. And to a family tree, isolation does things that textbooks don't prepare you for. A closed loop, a wreath, it turns it into a knot that pulls tighter with every generation until something breaks. And it wasn't their loyalty that broke. It was their DNA. Innocently enough, it started. In 1823, a man named Josiah Whitaker brought his wife and 4 children over the mountains into what would become West Virginia. They weren't running from anything. They were chasing land, cheap land, empty land, the kind of land where you could carve out 100 acres and never see another soul unless you wanted to. His brother Samuel, who'd settled 6 miles north, was Josiah's nearest neighbor. For the first generation, everything was normal. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Josiah's children married people from other families, farmers, traders, people who passed through the mountains on their way to somewhere else. But then the roads stopped coming. The passes closed in winter and didn't always reopen. The families that were there became the only families there were. And something quiet and terrible began. By 1860, each other, Josiah's grandchildren were marrying. First cousins, it wasn't scandalous then. It was practical. Someone you knew, someone your family trusted, someone who understood the mountain, the land, the code of silence that kept communities like this alive, you married them. But genetics doesn't care about practicality. A ledger is kept by genetics, and every time a cousin married a cousin, another mark in red was added to that ledger. Subtle were the first signs. Another with a club foot, a child born with a slightly misshapen skull, a girl who didn't speak until she was 6. Everywhere, these things happened, people said. It wasn't the marriages. It was bad luck. It was God's will. It was anything except what it actually was, a biological countdown timer that had just started ticking. For 4 generations, by the 1900s, the Whitakers had been marrying within the family. And different, not just sick, the children were beginning to look. The proportions you expect from a human being, their faces didn't quite fit. Too wide or too narrow, eyes were set. Backward, foreheads sloped. Into necks without definition, chins receded. Slurred and wrong, speech came out. The family didn't talk about it, even when their minds were sharp. You didn't talk about things like that. Your head down, you kept. The land, you worked. Your own, you took care of. But the neighbors noticed. They always noticed. And long before the science could explain what was happening inside those bodies, the whispers started. The DNA was collapsing, folding in on itself, eating its own tail. A medical anomaly that no doctor wanted to examine. By 1935, the Whitaker family had become. There were children being born who couldn't walk properly. Teenagers whose speech was so garbled that even their own parents struggled to understand them. Adults who looked 60 at 30. An extraordinary machine is the human body, but it's built on the assumption that genetic material will be shuffled and recombined with outside DNA. When that doesn't happen, when the same genetic errors get passed down and amplified through generation after generation, the machine starts to break down in ways that seem almost deliberate, almost cruel. Brutally simple is the science behind it. Recessive genes are carried by every human. Mutations, errors in the code that usually stay hidden because they're overridden by healthy genes from the other parent. But when cousins marry cousins, those hidden errors have nowhere to hide. Their mirror image, they meet. They activate, and what emerges is a catalog of genetic disasters that reads like something out of a medical horror novel. Immune deficiencies, skeletal deformities, neurological damage, organs that form incorrectly or not at all. Into bodies that had been sabotaged before they took their first breath, the Whitaker children were being born. A term geneticists use is inbreeding depression. Clinical, sterile, it sounds, but what it describes is the systematic biological failure of a bloodline. Intelligence drops, fertility crashes, physical abnormalities multiply. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. The family doesn't just get weaker, it gets stranger. By the 6th generation of cousin marriage, the Whitakers had members who couldn't reproduce at all. Others who were born with cognitive disabilities so severe they would never live independently. Some who died in childhood from complications that shouldn't exist in the modern world. Infections their immune systems couldn't fight. Hearts that gave out before puberty. Lungs that couldn't pull in enough air. And still the marriages continued because by this point it wasn't just tradition, it was necessity. Who else would marry into a family like this? Who else would take on the burden of caring for children who might not survive their first year? Genetically isolated, the Whitakers had become, not just by geography, but by the consequences of their own choices. In a cycle that fed on itself, they were trapped. Every new marriage between relatives made the next generation weaker, and every weaker generation made outside marriage less likely. A death spiral written in DNA, it was. And a biological cliff that science said shouldn't be possible to survive. By the mid-20th century, the family was approaching. In 1958, a young doctor named Margaret Halfford arrived in Odd, West Virginia, as part of a rural health initiative. From medical school, she was fresh, 27 years old, idealistic enough to believe she could make a difference in forgotten places like this. She was called to the Whitaker home on her 3rd week. A child had fallen ill. When she walked into that house, she later told a colleague, she thought she'd stepped into a medical museum from 2 centuries ago. The conditions weren't just primitive, they were impossible. 3 generations living under one roof. Adults who couldn't feed themselves. Children with faces that looked like they'd been sculpted by someone who'd never seen a human being up close. And a silence that pressed against her ears like deep water. The sick child she examined, pneumonia, treatable with antibiotics. But as she worked, she noticed the others, a teenage boy with a severe underbite and eyes that didn't track together. A girl of about 8 who communicated only in grunts and gestures. An elderly man, probably not yet 50, whose spine had curved so dramatically he couldn't stand upright. Careful questions Dr. Halfford asked. She was told the boy and girl were siblings, also cousins, also second cousins. A tree at all, the family tree wasn't. It was a tangle of roots that had grown back into themselves. Genetic counseling, she recommended. Like she'd spoken a foreign language, the family stared at her. Counseling, they didn't need. Alone, they needed to be left. What she'd seen, she tried to report, not to punish the family, but to get them help, medical intervention, educational resources, perhaps relocation to where the children could receive proper care. But the report went nowhere. The county had no geneticist. The state had no interest in opening an investigation that would expose something this ugly in the heart of Appalachia. And nothing to do with outside interference, the Whitakers themselves wanted. This long, they'd survived by keeping their business their own. 6 months later, Dr. Halfford left odd. Publicly about what she saw, she never spoke, but she kept a journal. And in that journal, she wrote something that still echoes across the decades: these people aren't victims of ignorance. They're victims of geography, poverty, and a biological trap that closed around them before they knew it existed. And we're letting it continue because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging how easily any isolated community could fall into the same hole. The silence wasn't just the families. Institutional, medical, social, it was. That some stories were better left buried, the entire system had decided, that some genetic disasters were too uncomfortable to discuss, that it was easier to let the Whitakers fade into obscurity than to confront what their existence said about isolation, poverty, and the limits of human biology. So, the families stayed in their hollow, and the marriages continued, and the children kept being born with bodies that barely worked, and America looked the other way. In 1972, the Whitaker family had reached its 9th generation of intermarriage, and something had fundamentally broken. There were now family members who would never learn to speak in full sentences. Not because of a lack of education, not because of neglect, but because the neurological wiring required for complex language had been damaged at the genetic level. Incorrectly, their brains had formed. Malformed were the speech centers, or missing connections that should have been there from birth. Sounds, they could make. Basic needs through gestures and noises that their family understood, they could communicate. But a story, they would never tell you, a complicated question, they would never ask you, the full range of human thought that was likely trapped inside minds that had no way to release it, they would never express. One researcher who studied isolated inbreeding populations described it as watching evolution run backward. Instead of humans developing more sophisticated traits, you see them losing the abilities that separate us from our distant ancestors. Speech deteriorates. Fine motor control degrades. The ability to process abstract thought diminishes. These weren't people with intellectual disabilities in the traditional sense. These were people whose hardware had been corrupted at the factory, whose bodies had been assembled with instructions that had been photocopied so many times the text was barely legible. And the cruelest part was that many of them seemed aware of their limitations. In their eyes, you could see it, the frustration, the isolation within isolation, trapped not just in a remote hollow in West Virginia, but in bodies and minds that couldn't connect with the world the way they should. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. In the comments, tell us what you would have done if this was your bloodline. The family had members who couldn't work, couldn't marry, couldn't leave. In a few rooms of a deteriorating house, cared for by relatives who were themselves struggling with the genetic burden they'd inherited, they spent their entire lives. For this level of need, there was no government assistance adequate. To handle a family where half the members required full-time care, no social services were equipped. Their own, the Whitakers took care of, because they had no other choice. Because no institution wanted to acknowledge what they represented, because their existence was proof that America had places where people fell through every crack in the system and landed somewhere the system pretended didn't exist. By the 1980s, some family members had never been photographed, never been to a hospital, never been officially registered with any government agency. Ghosts born into a family that had become invisible, they were. In a place that maps barely acknowledged, they were living. In the early 2000s, when journalists finally found the Whitakers, what they documented wasn't just poverty or isolation. It was biological collapse. The final generations of a family that had pushed human genetics past its breaking point and was now living in the wreckage of that experiment. And the most disturbing part wasn't what had happened to them. It was how easily it had been allowed to happen. How a family could implode across 10 generations while the rest of the world drove past on highways that came within 20 miles but might as well have been on another planet. In 2004, a photographer named Mark Leiter was driving through West Virginia, documenting rural poverty for a project that would never feel adequate to the subject. About a family up in the mountains, someone in a gas station told him. Said it in the way people share ghost stories, half warning, half dare. At the end of a dirt road that his GPS couldn't locate, Leiter found the Whitaker home. For the rest of his life, what he found there would haunt him. Not because of cruelty or violence, but because of what 10 generations of genetic isolation looks like when it's staring back at you through human eyes. The family members who could communicate were friendly, curious, even, they didn't get visitors. They didn't understand why anyone would want to photograph them. Hours there, Leiter spent. And from those visits, documentation of something American society had tried very hard to forget could happen emerged, adults who functioned at the level of young children, siblings who were also cousins 3 different ways, a family tree, a knot that couldn't be untangled without going back 150 years, a household where the toilet didn't work, where electricity was sporadic, where the youngest generation was being raised by people who themselves needed constant care. A family anymore, this wasn't. It was a biological dead end. Of an experiment in human genetics that should never have been allowed to run this long, it was the final chapter. Leiter's photographs went viral, but not in the way he intended. Horrified, fascinated, disgusted, people were. With cruelty and condemnation, the comment sections filled, as if the Whitakers had chosen this, as if any of them had asked to be born into bodies that didn't work right, as if they'd had options that they'd maliciously refused. But darker and more complicated than simple blame, the truth was. Of geography, poverty, isolation, and a lack of education about genetics that had persisted for generations, the Whitakers were victims. They were also victims of a society that had decided some problems were too ugly to solve, that had built highways past their hollow without ever wondering who lived up there in the trees, that had let poverty and isolation calcify into something that resembled a genetic curse. Some help, donations, medical evaluations, social workers who tried to assess what could be done, the attention brought. But by this point, the damage was irreversible. Of genetic compression, you can't undo 10 generations. A properly formed brain or a body that works correctly, you can't give someone, just because you finally noticed they needed it. The Whitakers who were capable of living independently were in their 50s and 60s. For the rest of their lives, the younger ones would need care, and there were no more children being born. The family line had finally exhausted itself. Its hands and quit, the genetic code had thrown up. After 2 centuries of circling inward, not with tragedy, but with a quiet biological surrender, the Whitaker bloodline was ending. Unable to create a next one, the last generation was born. In that hollow in West Virginia, the Whitaker family still exists today. Fewer of them now, time and genetics have done what intervention never could. Still there, more weathered, more forgotten, the house is. Older, quieter, still isolated in ways that go far beyond geography, the family members who remain are. A cautionary tale that most people would rather not think about, they've become. A reminder that human biology has limits, that isolation has consequences, that there are some mistakes that compound across generations until they become irreversible. What happened to the Whitakers wasn't unique. Across Appalachia, across isolated communities worldwide, the same pattern has repeated. The Fugate family of Kentucky, known as the Blue People, carried a genetic mutation that turned their skin blue because cousins married cousins for 6 generations. The royal families of Europe destroyed themselves with hemophilia and madness because they believed bloodline purity mattered more than genetic health. Further, the Whitakers just took it, pushed it longer, became the final expression of what happens when a family tree becomes a family circle. And until it's too late to matter, nobody stops it. Terms like genetic bottleneck and founder effect are now used by scientists who study the Whitaker case. They talk about recessive alleles and coefficient of inbreeding. Into data points and graphs, they turn human suffering. But beneath the clinical language is a simple, terrible truth: the human body needs diversity to survive. New genetic information, fresh combinations, it needs. The mixing of bloodlines isn't just socially healthy, it's biologically necessary. When that stops happening, when the same genetic material loops back on itself generation after generation, the code begins to corrupt. Errors accumulate. With typos that become mutations that become disabilities that become death, the body's instruction manual fills. Human biology, the Whitakers defied, but they didn't defeat it. Biology doesn't lose. It just takes its time. To evolution, 10 generations is nothing. A blink, a failed experiment that gets quietly erased from the genetic record, it is. And in that hollow in West Virginia, that's what's happening now. Not with war or disaster, but with simple biological exhaustion, the family is ending. Probably within the next 20 years, the final members will die, and there will be no one to carry the name forward. No children to inherit the land or the genetic burden. Where it began, in the mountains, in silence, the Whitaker bloodline will end, having proved nothing except that isolation is a poison that works slowly but completely. Their story should disturb you. Not because they were monsters or because they made choices that we can judge from a distance, but because they show us how easily biology can trap a family. How poverty and geography can create prisons that last for centuries. How a society can look away from suffering when acknowledging it would be too uncomfortable. In odd, West Virginia, the Whitakers are still there, still isolated, still living with the consequences of decisions made by ancestors who died before the Civil War. Still human, despite everything that's been taken from them, and still invisible to a country that would rather pretend places like this don't exist, that families like this are impossible in modern America. But they do exist. They are possible. And their existence asks a question that nobody wants to answer. How many other families are out there, trapped in their own genetic spirals, waiting for someone to notice before it's too late? Human biology was defied by the Whitakers, and human biology is still collecting its debt.